Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast, Top 5 Best Practices for Securing Self-Service, sponsored by Specops. I'm Tracy Cook with Redmond Magazine, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. We'll host a Q&A session after the presentations. We encourage everyone to participate, so get your questions ready. In the resource area of your console, you'll see a number of useful documents provided by Specops. We encourage you to take a moment and check those out too. And finally, the entire webcast is being recorded and will be archived for future viewing, and we'll send you an email when the replay is available. And now I'd like to pass the webcast over to our moderator, Scott Becker, editor of Redmond Magazine. Thanks for joining us, Scott, and please take it away.
Thank you, Tracy, and greetings to everyone. And as Tracy said, welcome to today's editorial webcast, where we're going to be talking about best practices for securing self-service portals. Extending self-service tasks to users conveys a variety of benefits, everything from reducing the burden on the help desk for repetitive tasks like password resets to empowering users to feel as if they have more control over their day-to-day tasks. However, extending self-service like this can also introduce a new level of risk. When letting users reset their own passwords or recover encryption keys, there's a high risk of handing over the keys to the kingdom. And when extending self-service capabilities to sensitive functions like password resets, it's critical that users are verified as carefully as possible with things like multi-factor authentication or sending messages to an associated mobile number, sending one-time recovery keys, or even a rolling list of security questions. So during this editorial webcast, we're going to get into all that. We're going to present several modern tactics to help your organization ensure that any self-service capabilities that it extends are done with the highest degree of security. Before we begin, I just need to run through a couple of details. As Tracy mentioned, if you'd like to submit a question at any time, just look for that question field to the left of your slide window. Type in the question there and hit submit, and we'll field as many questions as we get to at the end of the presentation. Also, this webcast is being recorded and will be archived for future viewing. So starting tomorrow, you can access the replay using the same link that you used today. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webcast. Later in the presentation, we'll hear from Liz Rivera for Specops Software. Liz is an IT professional with over 15 years of product marketing and management experience in IT software. As a product marketing manager at Specops Software, Liz has led the launch of various IT security products. Our featured speaker today is Nick Cavalancia. Nick has more than 25 years of enterprise IT experience and is a Microsoft Cloud and data center MVP with a focus on cybersecurity. He's an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist, and he's earned his MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI certifications. He's written and contributed to nearly 24 books, and he regularly speaks, writes, and blogs for some of the most recognized tech companies today on a variety of topics. So Nick and I will be discussing some of the factors and best practices around how to best secure self-service portals. Nick, welcome to the webcast.
Thank you for having me, Scott. It's good to be here. We're going to have a little fun here today, I think.
Great. So let's begin our exploration of some of those critical issues around self-service security risks. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you is what are some of the more common risks that get introduced when extending a self-service portal to employees or to customers?
It's a valid question. If we can, I want to first back up a little bit and just look at some overarching risks that exist with regard to credentials, so that there's we establish a baseline of why you guys in the audience even need to care about the risk that's associated when you put self-service in place. And if you look at the industry trends, credentials are huge, and they're hugely necessary as part of most attacks. Any kind of attack that involves any kind of accessing your data, your applications, your systems, lateral movement, island hopping, jumping from your network to one of your vendors or your partner's networks, that sort of thing. All of those involve the need for credentials. A couple stats that I'll throw at you actually before this webcast. I prepped a little bit here, and I grabbed a couple stats that are my go-tos. So from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, this, by the way, is not on the screen. I'm just simply talking to sort of somewhat answer in a very roundabout way at this point Scott's question. But according to the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report this year, 29% of breaches involve the use of stolen credentials. So we're talking almost a third here. There's a report from an endpoint protection company, Carbon Black, back in January of this year. 60% of all attacks involve lateral movement of some kind across your network. So if you think about that for a minute, lateral movement, of course, if you're not familiar with the term, means moving from one system to another, leveraging your internal credentials, which means eventually the bad guy looks like the good guy because they're using your credentials in order to move around. Another quick stat here. Let's see if I get this one right here. 60% of organizations that were attacked had multiple compromised employee accounts used to send lateral phishing attacks. So did one organization had multiple accounts that were compromised as well? That comes from Barracuda. That's their spear phishing top threats and trends. And then the last one I had here was from Ponymon's 2019 Global State of Cybersecurity in Small and Medium-Sized Business. So for those of you that are in smaller businesses thinking, that's great, Nick, but all those stats, they don't apply to me. I'm not a big company. I'm totally in the safe zone over here. 29% of SMBs have experienced credential theft in the last 12 months. So everyone's at risk. And so coming back to your question now, if we're extending this to self-service, one of the obvious issues here is we have to verify who the person is for sure. That's the biggest risk I can see with a self-service portal, because you're allowing users to reset their own passwords if this is integrated as part of, let's say, some kind of single sign-on, or perhaps even just the fact that the self-service lends itself towards giving you access to both on-premises resources, to Office 365 resources, things like that. You're giving someone not just keys to a single point of access, but giving them access to a wide breadth and depth of resources. So one of the biggest common risks I see is, if you guys are thinking about implementing something like a self-service portal, you really want to be very, very concerned about how do you authenticate who the person actually is. Is the owner of the credential actually the person that's asking for things like a password reset and so on? So that'd be the biggest risk I can think of, Scott.
Okay. Yeah, and just to get back to some of the stats that you were talking about, actually the third one to me was sort of terrifying. That 60% of the phishing attacks, I guess it was, were coming from, where there'd been a breach of multiple accounts. So you're actually getting the phishing attack from a legitimate email address, if I'm understanding that correctly. So it's not like you can hover over the username and see that, it's some crazy email address actually, and it's not the one that it's purporting to be. It's not spoofed. It's the actual email address where the phishing email is coming from.
Yeah, in this case, the lateral movement is the bigger issue. The phishing attack was the medium by which it came in, but the goal is to try and compromise credentials. But I'm making some assumptions here, but when I see that it's a phishing-based lateral movement involved attack of some kind, when organizations say we've had multiple accounts that have been compromised, part of that I'm going to attribute to the lateral movement. The fact that when I move from machine A to machine B, then when I get on machine B, I'm going, I got to get to machine C. How do I do that? And so if you have at least admin access on machine B, you can scrape RAM, you can see what accounts are in there, and then you find another set of credentials and you move to machine C, and the idea is that it just extends on. So I'm thinking that's part of the nature of the fact that lateral movement involves using multiple credentials, unless you happen to land on like the one endpoint where domain admins logged in, and that's kind of you go. It doesn't happen very often. As a matter of fact, that's called the breakout period, and the average time for that is something like I think the shortest on average is like 18 or 19 minutes. So it still takes a while. That doesn't happen very often, but for self-service, kind of getting back on track here for a second, when it comes to self-service portals, the issue definitely here is if someone's going to be asking to reset their password, asking, what's your mother's maiden name? We have Facebook, people, right? That doesn't count anymore. It's like, that's dead. And so that's the idea. You can't ask for just something very simple that anybody might know, especially with data breaches. Even like, what's your birth date? Well, Skype asks you for your birth date, which is why basically on Skype I have a fake birth date in there. I have a consistent fake birth date for every platform. It's the same one, but it's always fake that way. If they don't really know my birth date, they don't have it, because even that can be used to identify me. Those kind of things. So it's the real biggest issue here is, how do you know it's actually the person?
Gotcha. Okay. So, using can you explain why using a self-service portal in the first place is a step in the right direction?
Yeah, sure. One of the reasons here is if you think about the old, an old sort of standard of a help desk. Someone calls in, has a help, they talk to the help desk, they say they have an issue, someone logs the call, et cetera, et cetera. If we're still utilizing, let's say, voice, on the really simple end of the conversation is just simply, hey, thank you for calling the help desk. How may I help you? Hey, this is Scott Becker. Oh, not Scott Becker. You're Scott Becker, right? This is Scott Becker. I need to get my password reset. Oh, okay. Sorry to hear that. Yeah, I've been logging in and then a little social engineering. I've really been trying to do this and I can't get in anymore. And I really got this report that's got to get run and my boss is asking for. Can you just reset the password really quick? Yeah, and then to help this person reset the password, they don't validate who the person is. They just go, okay, the person called in. Maybe they'll look at the extension on the phone that it came from and it says S Becker. Okay, well then it must be Scott Becker, right? But it's not. It's me. Right? That's on one end. On the other end of that, just sticking with the phone for a moment, there's some great, if you guys have followed the concept of deep fakes, the deep fakes with the video and that kind of thing, you can now deep fake audio with nothing more than about 5 seconds of audio. It's been demonstrated. There's actually a company that helps do it for good purposes, not for evil. But it basically there's some phishing attacks have happened. That's a voicemail over voice kind of phishing attacks have occurred where people have actually pretended to be the CEO of the organization and made a phone call to somebody, that kind of thing, and left a voicemail. I really need this done. It sounds just like them because it is. They've been deep faked, and so even from that perspective, it's possible to make a help desk call and sound just like Scott Becker. And that kind of thing. So that's a little sort of seems far-fetched, but so did, if you roll the clock back 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, the idea of an attacker trying to laterally move within your network to try and find data that's of value, and now it's real commonplace. Yeah. So don't discount that.
Yeah. Okay. That phishing example is this is 2 answers now, and you've terrified me in new ways in 2 different questions. So good job.
Don't be scared. Be vigilant.
So for the next question, what are the proper levels of complexity or restrictions for passwords to help improve security for self-service portals?
Okay, so there's a great answer here, and it's funny because everyone talks about complexity. And back in June, Microsoft actually made some very bold statements about passwords. One of the things they did in June was they actually removed the password expiration policy as being mandated, by default. And one of the reasons they did that was because people, when they, you have to change your password every 30 days. Well, those of us on this call that are IT professionals, we all use, relatively secure, complex passwords. Most of us. But a regular everyday user, they might, living room 1. And then when the 30 days comes up, living room 2. And then the next 30 days comes up, living room 3. I mean, it's literally that, right? So Microsoft kind of came to realization that aspect was pointless. And some of the recommendations they make in the security update where they mention this is, 1, leveraging banned password lists. This is a little kind of out of scope, a little bit of what you're talking about, but this comes back to what's the perfect password. It's definitely not on a banned password list. So that's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Password with a 0 for the O. Those kind of things. Those are great starts to not have as passwords. And then the other thing here is to have length over complexity. There's actually a great Microsoft article, you guys. If you just search, if you Bing, I love that. I saw a comedian the other day saying, nobody actually says this, but if you Bing password length versus complexity, it was they were complaining about how it was like a plant. It had to be like a product placement because no one in their right mind is going to say that. It was very funny to hear that. But if you search password length versus complexity, there's a great Microsoft article that actually goes through the math and talks about having a length is much, much better. So if you were talking about trying to encourage users to have a secure password and have great password hygiene, the best practice would be it'd be better said as an example. I'm not saying this is the answer, but as an example, it'd be better said, why don't you type in a grammatically correct, regularly formed English sentence? Like let's say, Tommy is my #1 favorite child, exclamation point. with spaces and upper and lowercase apostrophes and whatever. And that I just made that up on the fly, but that's a whole lot better than putting asterisk hash, number 3, whatever. The complete length is always better than complexity. So length becomes key here. But as I know we're going to talk about in some of the following questions here, passwords alone aren't going to do it because, in essence, a lot of social engineering techniques are used to try and get people to harvest credentials out of people to get them to give up their passwords, and they're getting really good at it. I mean, we're getting logon pages, let's say to Office 365, that look absolutely identical. And then even if you're using Office 365's built-in multi-factor authentication, someone's actually built code that will go and handle the MFA requests. They'll see that Microsoft's asking because as you type in the password, they pass it to Microsoft. Microsoft says, give me the second authentication code that I sent to your phone. Then the hacker sends you that on the page. It pops up, hey, I need the code. Then you just type it in because you're authenticating, of course. And then they pass it back to Microsoft, and then they get in. It's nasty stuff. So passwords alone aren't the answer. It's going to be a much broader spectrum than that. But I know we've got some questions, so I don't want to steal your thunder. But hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. Yeah. No. One of the things that you were making me think of when you were talking about complexity, and especially when it was required that you change your password every 30 days. My other favorite on passwords is when you can't paste in like the complex password from a password manager. I'm seeing that less often than I used to, but it's like you've got this great password management tool. You go to copy it, into the web form, and it won't accept a pasted password.
I will agree, because what do you care how I put that password in? What is it? They do the same thing with banking account numbers. They don't let you paste in a banking account number. You have to type in each letter, and if you flip to the other page to figure out what it is and come back, you have to start all over again. Like, oh, you got to be kidding me. Why do you care?
It's like,
anyway,
it keeps the complexity.
It does.
All right. So how can organizations best leverage multiple verification factors to ensure that the person requesting the password reset is indeed who they claim to be, which gets to the point that you were just making about some of these nasty new attacks on Office 365?
Yep, the whole point here, just kind of level setting for a second with everybody in the audience, the whole point of having multiple verification factors is to absolutely guarantee that it's you. I don't know if you've seen in recent years where let's say you want to go get a lease for an apartment or something like that. I have one of my older kids was in college, and I had to get him an apartment. And as part of the whole thing to verify that it's me, because I was signing electronically for co-signing for the lease, they want to go through and they say, all right, well, you have to answer all these questions. And they're kind of about like your history, like what kind of car did you own between 98 and 2004 or whatever, and they give you a couple of cars, or what address did you live at? Those are actually those questions. Every question they ask you is really another factor, because the only person that would know it is me. Like, only I'm going to know whether I lived at any of those 4 addresses between these 2 years within the next 5 minutes without being able to search it, that kind of thing, that no one else will. And that's the idea. And so anytime that you're trying to protect access to, especially something like self-service, where someone's going to go back and reset the password and now basically has access to whatever that user has access to, having multiple factors is always going to be better. The trick here is to make sure that they're usable, that they're user-friendly. You're finding a balance between security and productivity. I mean, some of the factors, so we always have passwords. The NIST standards call them memorized secrets. It's a really fancy way for passwords, but that's passwords. You have security questions, right? Mother's maiden name, favorite toy as a child, those kinds of things, right? You have out-of-band verification, which would be like your SMS text to your phone, that kind of thing, but you got to be careful because SIM cards have already been shown that they've been copied, and then the SMS type messaging has been redirected. There's single-factor one-time passwords. That might be something that an authenticator app might generate. Smart cards, biometrics, and then the last one is third-party authenticators, which could be like some of the things you see now where you might be authenticating against, let's say you have a Gmail account, which has nothing to do with whatever system you're trying to authenticate. Like maybe you're trying to authenticate and do your self-service into your Active Directory account, but because you have a Gmail account and that's associated with your user account, it'll say, fine, go log into Gmail and we'll get back an authentication okay from Gmail, and it'll say that's definitely them, because that's another factor that someone may not know. So the whole idea of multiple factors is, one, the more factors that you ask for in concept, right? We know that if we ask people 12 factors before ever reset their password, that's not usable. No one's ever going to, users are going to say, forget this, and the adoption's going to go super low. No one's going to use it. That's not the answer.
Right.
But in concept, if I have like 12 factors before I'll reset your password, we know it's definitely you. And that's the idea. So more factors are better. The real challenge is finding the balance between the kinds of factors, like the ones that I just sort of mentioned, and that are possible, and then the factors that are easy for a user to adopt and utilize and feel like it's just part of their job, and it's not like, are you serious? Another fact? Oh, come on, just change my I'm not even. I'm going to lunch.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing. You want them to finish taking the password. So that's the goal.
Yeah. You know, do you have any, or have you seen anything about where that sweet spot is in terms of, you know, how much you can ask before, you know, or require before you've really gone too far?
I don't with regard to MFA, like how many is too many, but I will say this. I was a VP of marketing for 10 years for 3 different tech companies, and one of the things that we always fine-tuned was the number of fields on a registration form. So every single one of you in the audience says, you fill out a form for this webcast. You know, and for everything, you want to download a piece of software, download an ebook, a PDF, a white paper, whatever, you filled those out. And we always found it was like after like 4 was the industry standard, then it starts significantly seeing a decline in the number of people that will complete the registration. So there is a sweet spot somewhere. I'll bet you someone actually has done the research, just like you're sort of, implying it probably should exist, or it does. I'm just not familiar with it, but I would guess in my head it's 2 or 3, and then users are like, this is getting stupid. But even at the 3 mark, it's got to be something super easy, because maybe when Liz pipes on, maybe she can make some commentary there. But there's definitely a sweet spot. I'm just not sure what it is.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And this is actually a related question, but how should organizations establish different verification requirements based on organizational role?
Okay, good. That's a good question. So you guys in the audience probably already know where this is going. The people that have more access to sensitive data, to intellectual property, to customer lists, to personal information, all that kind of stuff, the higher the privilege, probably the more verification that's necessary. But that comes in a couple of ways. Let me kind of back up for a second. If you go back to the NIST standards, the government uses, so NIST 800-63. There's a couple of authentication levels that exist. It's authentication assurance levels, and the idea with those, and they call them AALs, and you hear that word assurance, it's kind of like, what kind of assurance do I have that that's really Scott Becker asking to reset Scott Becker's account? And that's the goal. So with AAL1, the way they put it is there's, quote-unquote, some assurance. I don't know what that means, but there's some anyways. That's usually either single factor or some kind of multi-factor authentication, but it's not mandated that you have to use a certain number of them, and so on. Then you've got AAL2, and that is, quote-unquote, high confidence, and that has to have at least 2 distinct authentication factors required. Okay, and then I have AAL3, and this is very high confidence, again, the air quotes there, and that is you've got to have possession of a key through a cryptographic protocol, and then you've got to have hardware-based authentication and an authenticator that provides what they call verifier impersonation resistance. So there's definitely some things in place that where you have an actual key, you're using cryptographic processes, and you have something that is actually designed around trying to thwart the ability for someone to go, I know what Scott Becker's mother's maiden name is. Sure it is. So it's much, much more secure than that. So coming back to the question, there's a couple of ways to tie verification to user roles. One is you think of it maybe from the perspective of the different authentication assurance levels, where I have additional factors, and I also have more secure factors, as the case might be. But when we apply that back to something like self-service, just speaking frankly for you guys in the audience, typically when you're thinking about a self-service solution, you bought it from a third-party vendor, right? Someone is providing you the self-service offering that may or may not have those levels, those degrees of, like, for example, with the authentication assurance level 3 having, like, a key with a cryptographic protocol, and that's okay that they don't. The idea is instead what you do is you then add on additional layers. Just like my lease agreement thing where I had to go through and figure out where I lived during a certain time and what car I had and did I ever have a loan from any of these companies between this year and this year. And, I mean, things that only I would know. Basically, they said someone's going to be, without us ever meeting them, is going to be agreeing to pay us for 12 months. We're not going to get screwed, so we're going to definitely make sure it's Nick Cavalancia. And they did. And they didn't get screwed. And just on a side note, not that anyone cares. But anyway, so at the same time, when you're thinking about, you're talking about giving someone access, to an account that may or may not be the person that is supposed to control that account, and that account has privileged and elevated access to data, to systems, to applications, to workloads, on-prem, in the cloud, whatever the case is. You've got to make sure that those things are correct, and that the person is correct. It's actually them. So typically when you have additional roles, you're going to want to make it a little more difficult. I hate to use that word, but it's true. Difficult for them to reset their password. Maybe it's just a little bit more arduous of a process because they've got to verify more ways that it helps indicate they're definitely themselves.
Yeah. Hey, one sort of related question, and maybe this is silly, but when it comes to putting your top priority on which users to sort of make it the most to use the questionable word difficult to reset their password, is it the CEO or the IT administrator who actually needs to have the most hurdles to jump through?
So that's a good question. I think it really comes down to, well, let me say it this way. I'm going to answer slightly differently. I am a big believer that every single user, every one of them, should have multi-factor authentication. Every one of them.
Yep.
Even down to the mailroom clerk. And this is why. So one of the tactics that gets used for you guys in the audience, one of the tactics used is if I could get access, let's just say to the lowest level person. Let's say the mailroom clerk is the lowest level job that has access to a computer, right, in the organization. And that being the case, if I as an attacker can get control of their machine and then I can gain access to maybe they've got a thick Outlook client or an Outlook web browser or whatever, and I can then send an email to everybody with a malicious link or a malicious attachment out to everyone in the organization under the guise of, hey, there's a package for you, but you have to sign for it first. Would you click this link? Right? Now we suddenly have the potential of infecting tens, hundreds, thousands of other people. So I'm a huge believer that anytime there's access to any kind of thing that can be leveraged on behalf of an attacker, that there is multi-factor authentication. So now coming back to your question, is it the IT pro or is it the CEO? I think the answer really comes down to what kind of access do they have and how detrimental would it be to the organization if those credentials were leveraged. I think in the case of the IT pro, it's far more direct. Right, so if there's an IT pro already has admin rights, you don't have least privilege access implemented, you don't have zero trust privilege in place, anything of that nature, it's far more instant. I get access to one of you folks in the audience, I get access to your credentials, and now I can do whatever I want. I have keys to the kingdom, so to speak. But with the CEO, I'd have to take a couple extra steps. That doesn't mean the CEO should have less, but certainly the focus really is on the IT person. But the CEO still, if they say, hey, I need you to send this out or send a check to so-and-so or, whatever, once you have access to the CEO, that's also, as critical. So I hope that answers it. It's a little ambiguous, I know, but there's no real right answer, but they're both really important. IT a little bit more.
Yep. That makes sense. And how should IT and security staff ensure that all users are, on board? Not trying to circumvent the password requirements.
No, that makes sense. The little thunder of mine got stolen by putting on the slide here, but certainly adoption equals security, and I want you guys thinking that way. And that's why I wrote this. I was thinking about my answers here for these questions. And as part of any self-service is the need to onboard first. Because you can't, self-service, no matter who makes the self-service product, you can't do self-service because you first have to validate the person. I mean, every self-service platform has some kind of validation process, some kind of multi-factor that answer a couple of questions or something along those lines. but you have to worry about the adoption being easy enough. So if it's super difficult for people to be able to enroll into that platform, then they're not going to use it. If they're not going to use it, there's no adoption. If there's no adoption, there's no security because no one has to do it. And then you're back to calling the help desk on the phone and saying, hey, it's Scott Becker. Would you change my password? I read this important report, blah, 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 right? So So I think the idea here with trying to get all users on board is to make sure that the enrollment process, the onboarding process, one is easily accessible. So certainly web-based would make a lot of sense. Should be easy to use, should be intuitive, the things that you would normally think of, and then at the same time also you're leveraging methods of authentication that just as they're really good to provide validation that it's actually the user, like in my example of maybe going out to Gmail or something, or Facebook, social media, or whatever, as just another authenticator. That's also something that the person's very used to doing themselves. And so it's not really a big deal, for example, if you were to say, okay, if you want to use Gmail, check here, and then it just opens up a little window. It says authenticate to Gmail. Well, I know my Gmail password. I type it in all the time. Boom, I'm done, right? Super easy, as opposed to, what was the account number for the car loan that you had in 1998? I don't know. I mean, that's obviously no one's going to have that. But my point is just something so ridiculous that people are like, how am I supposed to find that? And so no one's going to sign up. So you just got to make sure it's something that really is very user-friendly, user-centric more than anything. And at the same time, like, the best security is the security the users don't know about. And if you can figure out how to make sure that happens from an enrollment standpoint, you've got great adoption, and therefore you're going to have great security.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Those are some great insights.
It's an honor. Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to hand things over to Liz Rivera, who's going to tell us a bit more about Specops take on self-security or self-service security risks. So, Liz, take it away.
Thanks, guys. So just kind of wanted to start off with a few words on Specops software, who we are. So essentially, Specops has been developing simple Active Directory integrated solutions that really solve complex IT problems, and we've been doing this for over 18 years. And we offer two main product portfolios that focus on both security and efficiency. So our authentication and password management portfolio addresses everything from meeting audit requirements to reducing help desk password reset or encryption recovery key calls to finally securing the Office 365 login with multi-factor authentication. Then our desktop management portfolio maximizes efficiency by automating application and OS deployments to users' machines. We actually support over 5,000 customers across 50 countries, and really because of this footprint, we get firsthand insight into what organizations are doing with authentication and how they are securing or not effectively securing things such as the self-service. So with that being said, so essentially the ideal self-service outcome is to really balance cost savings with risk, right? So really the primary focus of self-service is for IT support cost savings. And really when that is the case, because of that, security oftentimes feels like an afterthought. So when implementing a self-service solution, especially one that facilitates self-service for high-risk use cases, such as the self-service password reset, it is important to balance cost savings and risk. So high-risk self-service use cases, again, such as the self-service password reset or something like an encryption key recovery, these use cases really need to enforce secure user authentication. So you really need to verify that the user is who they say they are before allowing them to, again, recover access when they're locked out by an encryption solution or when they want to reset their password, like Nick was saying earlier. If not, I mean, you're obviously leaving the door open to attacks. So the reality is that self-service often lags in user verification security. As an example, self-service password reset components within most identity and access management solutions or single sign-on solutions support limited authentication options, which by and large are not secure. So the options that they do support are by and large insecure. These typically include things like security questions or alternate email and or mobile verification code, in addition to, of course, password as the first factor. So their self-service component, the MFA within that is two-factor, and then, password plus one of these three, like insecure methods, is typically utilized. Again, the issue with this is that all of these are deemed insecure. Obviously, passwords inherently are weak. But then if you look at, SMSs, they can be intercepted. When you look at security questions, the ones out of the box, like what is your mom's maiden name or what's your dog's name? I mean, those answers can sometimes be easily guessed or socially engineered. And then email credentials, I think, with all the security breaches that are happening, every other month or every month, I mean, there's a high probability that these credentials have made it onto some leaked list. So basically, limited options, they don't only impact security, but they also impact users' ability to successfully authenticate. So then this, because you're not offering users a lot of options, right? So password plus something else, but my options are limited. So typically it would be password plus mobile verification code. Okay, if I don't have my phone on hand that day, that means I'm not able to successfully authenticate, whether that's because I forgot my password and I want to reset it, or whether now I'm locked out because I triggered a lockout and now I'm locked out by BitLocker. If I can't successfully get in, that call is essentially going to go to the help desk, which again is going to increase costs. But on the flip side, as Nick mentioned, the help desk user verification does not exist. So you're leaving yourself open to a vulnerability either way you look at it. So again, looking at the identity access management solution set just as an example, even though these solutions are light with self-service MFA, they do offer robust MFA for their primary use case, and that is, securing login to applications. And then, one would think that, the MFA platform that they offer would be consistent across the solution suite, but that is not the case. So this means that, now you have end users having to enroll twice in MFA. One, they're like essentially enrolling into the single sign-on or the identity access management solution to access those applications. That's, one enrollment. But then if they turn on the self-service component, users to enroll in that, and the MFA within that component would have to enroll again. So it doesn't matter if they're using the same forms of authentication, the enrollment is still, you have to do it twice. So it adds, a level of complexity and also creates an efficiency, which can then lead to, having a negative impact on usability and adoption. And, this is a point that Nick was mentioning earlier. You want to kind of balance security, but you don't want to make it too cumbersome for the users, because at the end of the day, if you're making it too difficult for them, they're not going to adopt it. They're going to think it's easier to call the help desk. So lag in user verification is also an issue within the majority of encryption solutions, self-service key recovery components, as these often also rely on security questions to verify users' identities. So although the purpose of such solutions is actually to increase security by making data unreadable to unauthorized users, an attacker could essentially gain access by using the security vulnerability as an entry point. All right, so Specops Authentication is a single multi-factor authentication platform that can be utilized across Specops Reset, which is our Active Directory self-service password reset, password change, and account unlock solution. It can also be utilized to facilitate multi-factor authentication for Specops key recovery, which is our self-service encryption key recovery solution. And again, it allows users to regain access to their device in the event of an encryption lockout. And then finally, our help desk component that lives within these two solutions also leverages the multi-factor authentication platform. And of course, this component can be utilized, independently of these two solutions and those two use cases, can essentially be utilized by the help desk to verify users' identities anytime that they're calling the help desk when the user is asking for like a high-risk action. So Specops Authentication not only secures these high-risk use cases, but it also addresses other multi-factor authentication adoption challenges. So the platform supports over 15 different authentication methods, and these include third-party ones like semantic VIP and duo security. This allows IT departments to not only move away from insecure security questions, but to also pre-enroll users into the system while extending the value of their existing MFA investments. So essentially, if you're using things like duo security or semantic VIP to secure a login to a specific application, you can reuse that to secure the password reset or the key recovery use cases as well. So you're just really extending the value of those existing investments, and at the same time really removing the need for end users to have to enroll in yet another form of authentication. The solution also allows IT admins to vary the enrollment policy from the authentication policy. And what this essentially means is that you can actually set the requirement to be you need to enroll with more forms of authentication that are necessary to then authenticate to complete the use case. And this really provides like failover options for users, again, in the event that they don't have their phone on hand to get like the text message with the mobile verification code. I mean, there are always various options. But then to preserve the security, because I think, Nick, you had said, maybe Liz can talk a little bit more about this. Yes, enrolling in more forms of authentication, yes, it is stronger by default, right? So using more than one factor is better than just relying on one. However, with that being said, it also boils down to what those factors are. So you could be using password plus security questions, and that's not much, that doesn't add that much more security. So it's really about being able to say, okay, I deem that security questions are not very secure, so I'm going to assign a security weight of 1 point to that versus I deem that, one-time passcode authentication app verification with that is much more secure, so I'm going to assign security weight of 3. And then to complete, the authentication policy, you would need a security weight of 4. So essentially, you can't authenticate just using questions and password, but you could potentially authenticate using password plus OTP. So essentially, this solution allows you to assign security weights, which is a really nice way of ensuring that users can complete the authentication in a quick way, but not at the sacrifice of security. So there are things to really consider. Yes, more factors, it's better, but not necessarily. It really depends on what the factor is. So that's all I have to say about that. And, of course, for more information, feel free to contact us by visiting our website at www.specopsoft.com. And just, leave us a note.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. And thank you again, Nick. And I'd like to quickly remind everyone that there's still time if you'd like to submit a question. Just look for that question field to the left side of the slide window and type in your question there and hit submit. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Okay, so we have a few questions that have already come in. Let me get to those. Actually, so Liz, a couple of questions have come in on the encryption product. What endpoint encryption solutions does the Specops product support?
So currently, Specops Key Recovery supports semantic endpoint encryption and Microsoft BitLocker.
Okay. And does that store recovery keys?
No, it does not store recovery keys. Those are managed and stored within semantic endpoint encryption and or BitLocker, and essentially the solution just fetches or retrieves those keys, upon successful authentication by the end user.
Okay. Here's a question. Maybe I'll start with Nick on this one. Jeff is asking, how do we change the paradigm of password versus passphrase?
Go
ahead.
It's a good question. Just to level set, if you're not familiar with that, password is a password generally has no spaces, that sort of thing. It's like password 1, exclamation point or something. That's a password. Passphrase would be more like what I said, where you said, "Tommy's my number one, favorite child," or exclamation point or something. Where that's got spaces and it's an actual phrase of some kind. So I think it's a really good question because it's very difficult to answer. It becomes something that either it's mandated through password complexity. If you can do that through like a self-service app, and it's going to go ahead and mandate that there's got to be a passphrase used, which means there has to be spaces. And then also some of that is security culture, which is a whole much bigger conversation. Because I'm not trying to get people to think about that cybersecurity for the organization is part of their job, in addition to their job, and that's why we're requiring it. So that's why they should be doing it, and that's more like around security awareness. That's a whole other topic. So I would tell you what it's not. It's definitely not going to be accomplished by having break room training or having one meeting once. This is something where you are going to probably have to mandate it to a degree, have to keep reminding people, and it's going to take time for them. Because the other part here is, you keep in mind for all of us on this call, the idea of a password, we see it as it's necessary. We want that password there. You probably have, even if you have literally 2, 3, 4 dozen passwords that you use across 2, 3, 4 dozen different systems, you know what every one of those are. Or you have some mechanism of grabbing this very long random string of stuff that in a password vault of some kind and pasting in every time or whatever. You figured it out, but most people haven't. They're not thinking along those lines. Passwords are a hindrance. It's just in the way. So I wish I had a better answer that's like, just dangle this carrot in front of them, it'll work, but it isn't that easy. It's as difficult as you think it is.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think just, piggybacking on what you were saying about the, taking more than the break room training, it also requires, the IT department to be on board, because it's not only, requiring a space, but actually allowing a space, in the acceptable characters. And, you often see, password boxes that won't accept a space. So you're kind of blocked out from doing a passphrase to start with. Liz, did you want to add anything on that as far as like what you guys are seeing in terms of that cultural shift? Or
I think Nick has a good point. I mean, there isn't like a silver bullet to answer this. I would recommend, and I think you touched on this, Nick, is essentially if you want to enforce this with solutions, you could, right? So you can enforce this with a third-party password policy solution that, you can just click on, I want to enable passphrase only, and, turn off complexity. I think on top of that, you need to also have something within the self-service solution that allows you to basically like provide users with this password or passphrase feedback. So this is what you need to do when you're like resetting your passphrase. It needs to be it has to have this many characters, etc. So I think enforcing it with solutions is a way forward. I also think if you have like features such as password length-based aging. So the longer your password is, so if you don't want to just go ahead and say, I just want to enable passphrases and not use passwords, you can have them both live within the same organization, but you can promote, the use of passphrases by having something like password length-based aging. So the longer your password is, the longer it can live. So then you're extending the shelf life. So then that is actually kind of having less burden on the user, but not sacrificing security. So they don't have to change it as often. So let's say it's 24 characters now instead of 90 days. It could live for almost a whole year, as an example.
Okay, great. Another question came in is about Specops is on the self-service password reset product. Does it support password blacklists? And I guess a related question is, what are some of sort of the best practices that you guys recommend for customers around password blacklists?
So our self-service password reset product works with our policy product, which supports a very robust blacklist. I believe right now we're at over 1 billion previously leaked passwords and phrases, and actually that list is continuously updated, and it actually also allows organizations to actually detect if a user is using currently a leaked password and enforce a change straight away, so you're not having to wait for users to change their password or add a password reset to block them from using or changing their passwords to something that appears on a leak list, but you could actually detect it in real time. And I think that is one of the best practices. Real-time detection is key. And of course, the size of the list is key. But from an end user's perspective, the ability to really provide them with that feedback. Hey, you failed to change your password because you're utilizing or trying to change your password to a leaked password, or hey, you need to change your password because we've detected that you are utilizing a password that is on a leak list. So it's also about effectively communicating with the end users.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've run through all of our questions there. So, Nick, did you have any sort of closing thoughts? For the audience, just about
Sure.
Self-service.
Yeah, I would tell you. One, there's definitely, I like the fact that Liz opened up with, talking about cost savings and security and trying to balance some of those things together, your risks. And at the same time, the idea of the self-service does end up lowering cost. And that's something that's been around for years and years, knowing that you could do that yourself. Password resets is nothing new. But the idea of doing it securely is. And so for you guys, if you're trying to sell this, for example, to your organization, whether it's Specops or anybody else, because I'm not here to endorse product, but if you're trying to get some kind of self-service in place, I would come at it from the standpoint of the security angle, the risk that exists, what the process looks like today in your organization, and the risk that it creates, and then you find a way to solve that using a third-party product. And then, but at the same time, for you personally, when you're shortlisting products, you've heard Liz talk about, for example, all the things that Specops does, and there's a lot more detail that she didn't even cover because she only has so many minutes. But you should start looking at it from a security standpoint where you're telling your organization you can help address those risks. You want to find the solution that's going to best help you truly address those risks, and at the same time, by making it easy to use, ensuring adoption, making enrollment easy, all that kind of stuff, you lower the overall cost of, over a long period of time, the total cost of sort of password self-service, ongoing management, if you will. So, think of this from a strategic level, from a business standpoint, both from a cost standpoint, from a risk standpoint as well, and I think that you'll be in good shape.
Okay. Well, thank you again to both Nick and Liz for your presentations today, and I want to thank the audience, all of you, for attending this webcast, and thanks to Specops for their sponsorship. So enjoy the rest of your day. This concludes today's webcast.